In this video, we're going to be diving into the world of first century Israel, a time and place that shaped one of the most transformative figures in history, Jesus of Nazareth. Let's set the stage. First century Israel wasn't just some random backwater place in the middle of nowhere. It was a pivotal crossroads, sitting right between major empires and trade routes. It was a land everyone wanted to control. Why? Because it was on the way to Egypt, and the gateway from Egypt to the rest of the riches of the East. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder described Judea as rich in its soil and vegetation, and well suited as the axis of trade between continents. And wherever there's a strategic route, you'll find battles, empires, and unfortunately, a lot of conflict. This is the world Jesus was born into, a land under Roman occupation, clinging to its traditions while struggling under the weight of foreign rulers. To understand the gospel accounts, it's important to grasp what life was like for the people of that time. Let's rewind a bit. Before Rome had its claws in Judea, the region was under the Seleucid Empire, a legacy of Alexander the Great's conquest. Now, Alexander wasn't all bad in the eyes of the Jews. When he arrived, they were under Persian rule, and the Persians, particularly Cyrus the Great, were known for their tolerance and even allowing the Jews to rebuild their temple. Alexander's arrival offered the hope of similar leadership, and he largely respected local customs, reportedly even visiting Jerusalem and honoring the Jewish God. But things changed under the Seleucids. Antiochus IV Epiphanes unleashed a campaign to force Hellenism on the Jewish population. He went as far as desecrating the temple in 167 BC by sacrificing a pig on the altar, an act so offensive it sparked the Maccabean Revolt. The revolt, led by the Hasmonean family, restored Jewish control and gave the people a brief period of independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. They experienced 80 years of independence, free from the control of any foreign power. Unfortunately, internal conflicts within the Hasmonean family, mainly power struggles between brothers, paved the way for Roman interference. In 63 BC, Pompey the Great marched into Jerusalem, ending their independence. Rome recognized and administered the region as three primary territories: Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, while establishing a client kingdom under Herod the Great from 37 to 4 BC, whose authority extended across additional territories such as Idumea and Perea. Herod was a savvy politician. Though not fully Jewish, he was of Idumean descent. He rebuilt the Second Temple into a magnificent structure to win favor with the subjects. After his death, his kingdom was divided among his sons. His oldest son, Archelaus, inherited Judea, the wealthiest region, but he proved harsh and unpopular, leading Judea to be placed under direct Roman control, with governors known as prefects like Pontius Pilate, who eventually governed from 26 to 36 AD. With Judea being under direct Roman administrative control, this ensured swift responses to civil unrest, which was quite common at the time. In fact, shortly after Pilate's appointment, he introduced Roman military standards bearing images of the emperor into Jerusalem. This act enraged the Jewish population because such imagery was seen as idolatrous. Thousands of Jews protested at Pilate's headquarters for several days. Pilate eventually backed down and removed the standards. Meanwhile, Galilee, where Jesus lived, was ruled by Herod Antiochus, one of Herod the Great's sons. This is the Herod Jesus encountered in the Gospels, distinct from Herod the Great, his father. Though they share the same name, they were two different people. Now let's zoom in on Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Nazareth was a small farming village in Galilee with just a few hundred people. Houses were made of stone and mud, and life revolved around subsistence farming. Archaeological findings suggest there was no long-term food storage in Nazareth, meaning families lived hand to mouth. Taxes made life even harder. The Roman tax collection system was ruthless. Tax collectors were responsible for delivering a set amount to Rome, but anything extra they collected, they could keep. This gave them every incentive to squeeze as much as possible from the people, making tax collectors some of the most hated people in the region. Interestingly, in the Gospels, the word sinner is often linked to the Greek term for tax collectors, telonis. Jesus even states in Matthew 5:46, "For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same?" This disdain for tax collectors was deeply rooted in the heavy financial burdens they represented, burdens that often forced ordinary families into devastating cycles of debt and loss. Farmers often had to take out loans to pay their taxes, and when they couldn't repay, their farms were seized by Roman creditors. Those former landowners then worked as tenant farmers on their own land with no food surpluses to rely on. Imagine losing your ancestral home only to remain on the land as a tenant, working tirelessly while most of your harvest is claimed for Roman taxes. It's no surprise that resentment towards Rome ran deep, fueling widespread anger and frustration. In the middle of this hardship, the Jewish people clung to hope. Their scripture spoke of a Messiah, a deliverer who would free them from oppression and restore David's kingdom. But this wasn't just a spiritual hope. Many Jews dreamed of a political leader who would overthrow Rome. This hope tied into the idea of the lost tribes of Israel and their eventual restoration. Back in 722 BC, the Syrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and scattered its people across various regions, a deliberate strategy to prevent rebellion through population displacement. This scattering gave rise to the concept of the lost tribes of Israel, as 10 of the original 12 tribes were exiled and seemingly disappeared from history. By the 1st century, many Jews believed that the coming Messiah would not only deliver them from oppression, but also gather the lost tribes, fulfilling prophecies like Isaiah 11:12, which speaks of assembling the banished of Israel and gathering the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. This expectation of reunification added to the fervor and longing for the Messianic deliverer. Education in 1st century Israel wasn't about formal schools. Synagogues were the center of communal learning, where scriptures were read aloud and discussed. Even if most people weren't literate, they were familiar with stories from the Hebrew Bible, like Daniel's vision of the Son of Man. This imagery fueled messianic expectations and apocalyptic thought. I saw in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven. There came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. This vivid imagery from Daniel would have resonated deeply with 1st century Jews, sparking hope for a divine deliverer who would establish an eternal kingdom. In a time marked by oppression and uncertainty, the vision of the Son of Man, coming with glory and dominion, offered both comfort and powerful expectation of redemption. This anticipation set the stage for the arrival of Jesus, whose teachings and actions would profoundly change and fulfill those long-held hopes. As a 1st century Jew, there were plenty of reasons to be upset, not just with Rome, but also with the local Jewish leadership. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't just a religious building, it was the beating heart of Jewish life. Pilgrims from across the region traveled to Jerusalem for major festivals like Passover, the very celebration underway when Jesus was arrested and crucified. The priesthood oversaw sacrifices and rituals, but by the time of Jesus, it had become politicized. The high priests were often appointed by Rome and came from elite families like the Sadducees, creating tensions with ordinary Jews. The Dead Sea Scrolls, written by a separatist Jewish sect, had harsh words for the priesthood. One text accused the priesthood of walking in paths of wickedness and pride, and turning the temple into a den of corruption. This distrust between the common people and the religious elites was palatable. The common Jewish person in 1st century Israel had plenty of reasons to feel discontented with their circumstances. On one front, Rome ruled with an iron fist, exploiting the land and its people for resources and taxes. On the other, the priesthood, meant to be sacred servants of the people, had become deeply corrupt. Instead of championing the faith, these leaders profited from religious practices while cozying up with their Roman overlords, leaving many Jews feeling betrayed by those who were supposed to be their spiritual guides. So what was 1st century Israel like? It was a land of contrast, hope and oppression, poverty and grandeur, faith and corruption. The Jewish people were waiting for deliverance, clinging to the promises of a Messiah. This is the world Jesus stepped into. When you read the Gospels, understanding the backdrop makes his words and actions all the more powerful. He wasn't just speaking to individuals, he was speaking into a world aching for redemption.